So alder can be a wonderful tree, of course, and it's been underappreciated for many years. There have been a lot more studies over the years on how to kill it than how to grow it. This was part of a project I worked on called the RAS, Red Alder Soil Site Study, and we went to a lot of different sites in Washington and Oregon, and this was one of my favorite sites. And those of you that are good on your plant ID may be able to tell that there's actually Oregon grape going in the bottom of the understory. And several people have told me, you don't see Oregon grape in alder stands. And I always say, I have a picture of it. You can see Oregon grape in alder stands. May not be the most common understory plant, but you can see it. So probably some of you are here because there have been increases in prices in alder saw logs. When I first moved here from the East Coast, I was really amazed at how people just completely ignored alder because I came from a part of the country where hardwoods were common. People managed hardwoods, they sold hardwoods, and so it's been kind of interesting to see how the prices have gone up over time. And on the right site, alder can grow quite well. So where should you plant it? Whether it's on a farm setting or out in the forest, and then where should you not plant it? Of course, you can't always control whether or not your stream is going to decide to find a new channel. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, in part, there's a seat up in the very front. Comes from two older publications. One of them, this method of site quality evaluation for alder, and I'll pass it around. And we do have it online. That's another one for you to pass. And the one that evaluation of site quality for alder, which was in the book that's going around. But that particular paper is available online. But we can always print things out and mail them. So if you don't like to do things online, you can get your publications other ways. So as I mentioned, a lot of this information came from 40 sites that we sampled. This early project, they were all natural stands, a lot of different landowners, companies, private landowners, public agencies. Plus we got data from other organizations. And one of the things that's important is to distinguish between where alder can grow and where it can grow well. So this was one of the sites that we did in the study, very poorly drained, and there was alder growing there, but it was not growing well. So sometimes people say, oh, alder, it prefers the wetter sites. Well, it doesn't prefer the wetter sites, but it can tolerate some poor drainage. So the Soil Conservation Service has divided soils into 7 drainage classes, going from very poorly drained to excessively drained. And the excessively drained would be out here, but we never found any alder sites that were on excessively drained soils. So if you have the somewhat excessively, it's not one of the better sites. And these diamonds mean that it was found in a lower flat, so it would tend to get a little extra moisture being, just from the topography of the setting, but that's not one of the better ones. But the very poorly is not one of the better ones, but this actually poorly drained, you can get some of your very best sites, but you can get some pretty good sites across a pretty wide range of drainage classes. But not the very poorly, don't go for that. So elevation, probably most of you know that alder is really going to do best at lower elevations. You're going to get your very best sites at your elevations less than 300 or 400 feet, but probably acceptable if it's less than this 1,600 feet or so. But if you start planting alder up at 3,000 feet, You can find alder stands up, near Snoqualmie Pass, but they're not growing well, and you're going to get a lot of top damage. So what have we learned about the relationships between the quality of sites for alder and soil factors? When you think of Douglas fir and our conifers, we often think of nitrogen as being the element that's most likely to be limiting growth. But alder is a nitrogen-fixing species, and so we don't usually think about nitrogen. There is a cost to the tree of supporting the nodules, so you would actually get better growth rates if you applied nitrogen, but it would never be economical to do that. The one element that sometimes is limiting the growth of alder is phosphorus. So I'm not suggesting that people run out and apply phosphorus, but you're going to get the very best growth of alder on sites that have fairly good phosphorus. So if you just happen to know from other information about that soil that it was low in phosphorus, that might, get you to say, oh, I don't know about that. But generally, alder is not one that people fertilize. There's very little known about the effects of micronutrients, but we do know that the best sites usually have low values for iron and manganese. And I think, again, this is due to drainage. So you tend to have higher levels of iron and manganese on sites that are very poorly drained. So when I first put this slide together many years ago, I was saying, well, you probably wouldn't want to plant on soils that are in the ultrasol or histosol orders. And people are like, what? What are these crazy words you're coming up with? But this is part of the soil taxonomy. And of course, you don't need to know any of this, but I'm going to show you how you can get this kind of information if you actually want to go through the factors for evaluating your sites. But basically, ultrasols are very old soils, and they've been leached. So they have poor nutrition. And that's true for all trees. I mean, Douglas fir doesn't grow well on ultrasols. Histosols are organic soils. So if you get some of them kind of on a bog, histosols. Andisols are developed from volcanic materials. So we've got quite a few andisols around this area. But your very best soils are going to be the entisols and the inceptisols, which are young soils. So not very much leaching, very minimal soil development. So one of the things that I think is really great over time is that the Natural Resource Conservation Service, I see a lot of people with gray hair in the room, remember the old Soil Conservation Service, but they've got a lot of good information online. And they have this web soil survey. And when you first look at it, or you see someone talk about it, you say, oh, I don't want to do that. I like my old paper soil surveys. But it really is kind of neat, and it's very easy to use. You just go and you click the little button that says Start. They really did design it so that, it would be very user-friendly. So this is called the Web Soil Survey. And you can, there's lots of different ways to select an area. So if it happens to be behind your house, you can just put in a mailing address. You can start by putting in the state and county and then zoom in. You can put in the latitude and longitude. You can put in section, township, and range. Lots of ways so you can select the area that you would be interested in. And then once you've zoomed in and gotten the area that you're interested in, then you can ask for soil information. And so by selecting this rectangle here, then it shows these polygons, which are the different soil series. So in this case, we have map unit 67, Melbourne, silty clay loam. Some of you may be familiar with that. That's the soil series that you'd find in Lewis County. Sulcum, silty clay loam, and then there's two different divisions based on the slope. So depending on once you found your area, then you could see what the soil series is. And then once you know what the soil series is, then there's all kinds of information. So you can see the series, what it's derived from, frost-free period. It'll tell you even something about the range in elevation and temperature. It'll tell you the drainage class, depth to water table, lots of different kinds of information. And it's really very well set up. I was impressed. I hadn't been to this site in quite a few years, and when I went back to it, it's like, wow, they've really upgraded it. And they have really good step-by-step instructions. So you can go in and find your area and then go in. So if you're looking through some of these different areas, these different guides that I've put together, and it asks you for a piece of information, you can almost always find that piece of information once you know what what your soil series is. And this actually is an area near our house, and it's just another example of, like here we have a Scopopa silt loam, which actually is pretty good. No, here's the silt loam down here. And then here we have this gravelly sandy loam. And so if I were going to plant alder, I'd want to plant it down on my silt loam, not up on my gravelly sandy loam. So when I developed this site evaluation guide. There are three main factors. The one that was most important is geographic and topographic position. And I'll go through some of the specifics in just a minute, but just kind of big picture, look at elevation, position on the landscape, aspect and slope, summer precipitation, and special hazards. And that factor has a maximum of 20 points. And then the next factor has a maximum of 12, so you can just see that this next factor down is not quite as important. Looking at soil moisture and aeration. So the internal drainage, texture, soil depth, rock and gravel contact, depth to summer water table, and almost all of these things you can find in your the descriptions online for your soils. And then soil fertility and physical condition. Because nitrogen tends to be the element that's most limiting tree growth in this area, and alder is a nitrogen fixer, this element tends to be less important. But on the other hand, if it's very leached, some of those old soils, it's still not going to be good. And the pH, if it's super acid or super alkaline, it's not going to be as good. So let's go through those by category. The first one, geographic and topographic position. The very best number you can get is if the elevation is less than 350 feet. So low elevation sites. The very best sites are going to be in floodplains or at the toe of a slope, so they're going to get a little bit of extra moisture in the summer. Aspect and slope, and as you might guess, the best sites are going to be ones that are fairly flat and have good rain in the summer. So 18 inches of rain from April 1 to September 30th is actually quite a bit for this area. So it's, the sites that are going out a little bit more toward the coast, picking up that, summer precip. Special hazards, it's best if there are no hazards. And I'll show a slide a little bit later, but if you have an area that is up and it's kind of in, well, obviously a mountain pass would not be good, but even if it's kind of a somewhat of a pass where you're going to get wind whistling through, that's not a good site for alder. You want to have it in positions where it's a little bit more sheltered by the topography for your best sites. So again, the best by category. What you generally want is a soil that's generally well drained, but has many thin layers. And it's like, well, what's these thin layers? And it's kind of interesting when you take soils. One of the things that you learn is if there's any change in soil texture, whether it's going from a coarser texture to a finer or a finer to a thinner, any change in texture slows down the water movement through the soil profile. So if you happen to go look at a soil profile and you see there's lots of thin layers, of course floodplain would be one example, but if for any reason you get several layers in the soil, it's always going to slow down that water movement. And so it's going to be a better site than one that has just one texture all the way through, even if it's a good texture, but having multiple layers is good. But generally the best textures, if you're just going to have one texture, only a few, is going to be a silt loam, silty clay loam, or a loam. Soil depth, at least 32 inches without any kind of compacted or cemented layer. Many of our sites that have these cemented layers from the glacier, as long as it's at least 32 inches to that layer, then it's okay. Rock and gravel content, some gravel's fine, but we want to have less than 25%. And depth to summer water table, you don't want it to be too shallow. So 6 to 10 feet's the best. So once the trees get established, get their roots down, they're still getting access to that water during the summer, but they're not, their roots are not being killed by having too much water close to the surface. And this last category, soil fertility and physical condition. As I mentioned before, young soils, particularly ones where you have water-carried deposits, pH that kind of 4.6 to 5.5. Pretty easygoing organic matter. You don't want it too high, but you don't want it too low. And of course, like all trees, it does best if compaction is low. So I forget what year it was. Seems like it was around 10 years ago. We got some pretty good ice storms going through this area. And ice damage is not always avoidable. Obviously, if you're at higher elevations, you're going to have more ice or snow damage. But sometimes you're just, it's just a bad year. You're unlucky and you're going to. And alder, unfortunately, is not as strong a wood as some of our other species, and so you can get problems with ice. But anything you can do in evaluating the site to say, oh, yeah, there's been quite a bit of ice damage here, then it's like, oh, that's probably not a good place to be thinking about alder. Frost can be a serious problem. In tree nurseries, like this is a picture from the Webster nursery, my office is next door to it, and some years I walk by and it's all white, and so it's going to be cold, and they've gone out and they've sprayed water to protect the seedlings from being too cold. And so in those tree nurseries, they can frost protect by spraying water on seedlings. But what can you do? Well, not a lot, but one thing you can do if you're just going to start planting, you're planning your site, you could plant as late as possible to avoid spring frost. Particularly if the seedlings have been in cold storage, they're like supercharged for bud burst. Their dormancy has been satisfied, and it takes very little warm temperatures before they burst bud. And so so often if you plant a seedling, like say you're going to plant in February, it would actually burst bud earlier than the naturals would on the same site. Just that first year, because it's had that time that it's been in cold storage. So if you're going to plant, you'd want to plant as late as possible to avoid spring frost. But of course you don't want to plant too late, because then the root systems don't get established before the summer drought. But I know with people who've planted larger acreages of alder, it's like the last species they plant. They plant everything else and then get in the alder real quickly at the end of their planting season. In some circumstances, you might be able to plant early. That is, particularly if you were able to get containerized seedlings. In some cases, they're available in the fall, and so if you had the soil moisture in the ground, you could plant in the fall, and then the trees would just get natural chilling, and then they would burst bud at the normal time in the spring. So they would be less likely to have problems with frost right after planting.
Connie,
Yes?
could you explain how the nurseries track the chilling hours for cold hardiness?
So they, different nurseries do things slightly differently, but basically they are recording how many hours the trees are between like 35 and 45 degrees. And the more hours that you have of that, those chilling hours, then the fewer hours you need of warm temperatures before they'll start bursting bud in the spring. But one thing that they've learned over the years is that whether a seedling is in cold storage or whether it's natural out in the woods, if you have the same number of chilling hours, the tree's going to respond similarly in terms of it's ready to start growing in the spring. Does that make sense?
And they also use that as an indicator of when they can start lifting from the nursery. They want to get the chilling hours in.
Some nurseries don't want to put the trees into storage until they have so many chilling hours, or in some cases they're also looking at their roots or other things. But one of the important things for alder is it's very sensitive to frost pockets. So you don't want to plant in any area that's got a frost pocket or kind of cold air drainage. And so often I tell people to scout around and see where alder is or is not growing. After a while, you kind of get your eye into it, so you can say, oh, yeah, there's kind of an area where we've got cold drainage coming up from the hill and kind of pooling down in this kind of basin area. And that can be a place just up a little bit, on the side of the hill, the alder could grow really well, but right down in that area, if it tends to be an area that you get a lot of frost, that's not where you'd want to plant your alder. So what should you plant, assuming you're going to plant? These are some pictures that I got from Nabil Kaduri, who works at the Webster Nursery. And you want a good balance of root and shoot. You don't want them too tall. And so some nurseries let the alder get away from them. And I remember years ago when the Forest Service was growing some alder at Wind River, and they used to send them out in what they called body bags because the trees were about 5 feet tall. And then sometimes they just chop the tops off, and that's not necessarily the best either. But if you could get something that's like this size, the good balance. You want, so most of you have seen these little nodules that are on the roots, and that's this result of this symbiotic relationship between alder and this other organism that actually fixes the nitrogen from the air. It takes the nitrogen out of the air and makes it available for the tree roots to take up. So when you're going to plant seedlings, they should already have some nodules on them. And occasionally there'll be a nursery that hasn't grown alder before, and they'll offer alder seedlings that don't have any nodules on them. And I see if you can avoid, be able to take a look at the seedlings before you take them. They will usually eventually get nodulated in the wild, but it's just a delay. And most good nurseries, they make sure when they're like putting them in their the styro blocks when they're first starting them or something. They'll have ground up nodules, and so they're actually adding a little bit so that they'll get nodulated early. You want them so that they can tolerate a bite or two. So if they're too short, you know, a real little short guy, then, you know, it's just one good bite for a deer, or, you know, one good bite for a rabbit. So getting something that's a little bit taller and not too tender. So generally, I don't recommend that people plant alder seedlings that have green bark. You'd actually like to see the stem that has brown, reddish, you know, kind of brown bark, not the green bark, just because it's tender. You want them to be woodier so that the animals are less likely to eat them. And as I say, you want to have nodules on the roots. One of the things that I didn't realize for several years, this is kind of going off on a tangent, but I always thought of alder as having this light gray bark. But in fact, the natural color of alder bark is brown. And when you see all that white and light gray, it's all lichens. It's the only place that you actually see alder bark of older trees that's actually brown is around areas of high air pollution. So if you go up around, it used to be up around the mill at Port Angeles, or you know, anywhere there was some kind of, or up on Vancouver Island, anywhere where there were some high areas of air pollution, you'll actually see alder that has brown bark. But the rest of it, when you see all the gray, light-colored bark, it's all lichens. And I didn't know this for years when I was studying alder. So that's your trivia for the night. So this is Nabil, who loaned me some pictures. And this is the second growing season after planting. This is a picture taken by Mike Warjon on a Port Blakely site. It was a low elevation site with good soil, had good summer precipitation. It was not in a frost pocket. They did some pre-plant vegetation control. They had good planting stock, which was this P plus a half, which means they started it in a plug, and then they transplanted the plug into a nursery bed for a few months. They called it a half a season, but it's all grown in one season. But by putting it in the plug and then transplanting, they get a good fibrous root system, so they get a good balance of the tops and the bottoms. So just a reminder of some resources for you. You can look at this Western Forester, that March 2009 has got several different articles about hardwoods, including one by me on evaluating sites for planting hardwoods in the Pacific Northwest. And I did bring a couple extra copies of that, which I am not planning to take home, so hopefully you'll grab a few. And with that, we can turn on the light and I'll have questions.